general concept will be pretty much the same. And in general, for using these Ajax libraries, they're all written in JavaScript, and you just import a JS file, and we'll see that all the commands begin with this $.ajax to invoke them. Typically, how we're sort of working with this is this thing called data-centered Ajax, where the server's going to send us some raw data. Typically in JSON format, it's more sort of geared towards JSON strings for it. The client, the browser client, will parse that data and build the page out of it. And in that you generally use a method or a function beginning with this $.ajax to invoke, examine that server data, and perhaps sort of build to it. If it's content-centric, they're the servers built for you the exact HTML to insert. They're not sending you JSON or XML. They're just saying, here you are, here's the exact data, just push this in for it at a certain sort of point to it. Now that might be just straightforward string data that it's put in, or it might be pre-formatted HTML for it, and all the client's got to do is insert it into the page somewhere, perhaps with a style sheet to customize the look for it. And in that case, it was something called a load function that just does it direct, and it says insert server data directly for it. There's another version that we're not particularly sort of touching on, this script-centric, where the server also sends you JavaScript functions. This is a case where you're loading software that will also run, depending on what you click, it will bring in extra software, extra objects to it, and then the client can execute those functions. It's just too much to what we can actually fit in. It is used, and it's used a lot, but there's only a certain amount of stuff that we can fit in. But the general form of an Ajax call is that it looks like a string of JSON as well to it. And you just give a series of name-value pairs, and then when the interpreter runs that particular line, it uses those parameters to decide what to do. Because you know that, like, I mean, these are some of the functions that were built up in that JavaScript library. You were using that Ajax utils with things like execute Ajax with an address or something. I can't remember the exact sort of function name to it. But you pass an address and a URL, a placeholder of where to put the result. And the Ajax functions work with a JSON string with these multiple name-value pairs in it, and that's a sort of minimum number there. Where in this case we're specifying a parameter called URL and a parameter called success, which hopefully, as its name sort of makes fairly obvious, it's going to go off to that address, and when it comes back, it'll perform that handler function to sort of do it. So it's going to access that resource at that URL, relative URL. So it might come that address has got to be able to be found on the server when it comes for it, and then pass the result over to that handler function. A couple of notes there about making sure that you get the syntax right. Often forget the dot part in there. That you get incorrect options for the sort of curly braces and things, that you don't lay the JSON out for it. It only works if you've got a web server replying. Some people sort of found that sort of last week. You've got to have something that's actually running over on the server for it to listen to for it. Now there is a little test program that comes in the demos for this week. When you load up in Eclipse, there's some. When you load up in Eclipse, you'll see some JQuery Ajax 1, 2, and 3, and some of the demos of what we'll be working through. They are invoking some of the servlets over on the remote site that will be held in the source folder. They may be invoking JSP, just similar to what we were doing with the Ajax last week. I've got those in a web browser, so it makes it a bit easier to see rather than running that internal browser to sort of work with. So when we're running them, you can just sort of load these things up and test it out with certain sort of JQuery tests for it. Now, if you want to create your own one, the ones that I've given you, just import as an Eclipse project. But if you want to write your own one from scratch, and I sort of added this bit because some people were writing their own apps where they wanted to start their own sort of answer to a question. You don't just create a standard Java project, you have to create a dynamic web project, and that sets up an appropriate folder structure for it. So it sets up a web content folder, sets up the right sort of libraries to sort of work with, and you can test it out running this jQuery test.html just to show that, demonstrate that it sort of works, and that will bring up a few little sort of test ones. And if you get sort of screens like this, you'll see that it's working. We'll do this just in the lab, just to make sure that your computer's set up. Because again, you know, sometimes we have a few problems with somebody's server not quite sort of set up right to it. But just getting into how we sort of actually sort of put it in there. The general format, the minimal form, is this .ajax with some options within it there. As I say, fairly minimally, you give that address and the handler function to deal with your returning data. And that will auto-generate in the background those JavaScript pieces of code that we had last week to create an XML HTTP response request object to sort of do the bit about populating that object with where it's to go and where it's to go when it comes back, and then to actually execute it. That's all done by the Ajax function for it. There's a few other options that we can put in about to include the data to it, what sort of data type you're sending up, whether it's XML or JSON that you're sending them, where to go in case there's an error to deal with it, usernames, passwords, a whole sort of range of options to sort of get it in there. So just as an example of how you would use it in your code, it's just used directly in the JavaScript. So you might have a JavaScript function saying pop-up result from the sort of server text there. That call to it, supplying that address and success to sort of pop-up result, is a thing that actually invokes that pop-up result. So we've got a function, that's the actual sort of function to display the result. The Ajax one will then invoke that when sort of called to sort of get around it, and it replaces some of the code that will just sort of refresh you on just in a sort of second. So you'd normally have some sort of more complex handler to it, you know, like we had before. You're not just going to pop up your results in a little sort of data alert box. You've generally got some sort of function handler that takes the response from the server together with some sort of status message, success, page not found, that sort of thing. Not always sort of too useful. It's more sort of an error handler. It's a status string that we want. But you'll also get that request object coming back. But what they're replacing is all this sort of code that we had last week. So before, with the basic Ajax, with raw JavaScript, we got a request object. We set up some function for the onReady state change, where to go when you get back. We put in where we're going for the URL, what type of request you're doing, and actually sort of invoked it. And then you have the response handler to it. But in Ajax, that's just replaced by the one line. So you specify the address, you specify the handler function, and basically that just takes a role of that to do. Because you're always doing that. That's the same sort of basic bit of code that you're doing for all your calls, getting a request object and then invoking something to actually go off and invoke it. So it makes it a bit sort of similar, it makes your code a lot sort of smaller. All you're doing is you're just including a JavaScript library that tells you how to do that for it. So in terms of a sort of complete example, that's a sort of basics. We're going to invoke something on the server here. We're going to invoke some resource on the server like a JSP file. And then we're going to have a JQuery file with where that .ajax is defined, those sorts of approaches to it. Together with an HTML that loads the JQuery, all the data around it, defines the button that invokes it. The idea being that the server side, in this case it's just a JSP displaying a date. Last week you did one of the exercises where you got back a number. If you just invoke that servertime.jsp, it just sends you the date back to it. We're going to invoke that ourselves. So our function called showtime here, and the showtime function is the thing that's going to be invoked by our button. So in showtime we'll just say do an Ajax call to servertime.jsp, and when you come back go to show alert. Now you could have written that sort of implementation of that call yourself. In fact, that's what was in the original Ajax utils one. It's just one of the things that JQuery does for you. So it goes off the server time, and when it comes back, invokes this show alert and passes the sort of text into it.